Hello and welcome to the third episode of a Lexicon of Life and Death. My name is Lynn Barger Elliott, and I am the executive producer of Completed Life Podcasts. I am joined by Mark Barger Elliott, executive director of the Completed Life Initiative. Together in this series, we are defining a lexicon and exploring the vocabulary we use to express beliefs, hopes, and attitudes towards life and towards death. So far in our series, we have considered the Finnish word sisu, which translates to courage against all odds. Our second word was created by the Minnesota-based author John Koenig in his book, Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows. There he combined two Spanish words to form the word suerza, which essentially means gratitude for being alive. The word we add to our lexicon today comes from the English language and derives from the Latin word trans, which means across or beyond, and plantare, to plant. We know it in English as transplant, a word that speaks to the potential and the peril of moving, of movement. This led me to reflect over the past week how in many ways all of life is moving. All of life is engaged in movement. For example, can you guess how fast the Earth is spinning? The answer is about 1,000 miles per hour. The reason we don't notice how fast we're moving is because the speed is steady. So if the Earth moved at the speed of 700 miles an hour in the morning and 900 miles an hour in the afternoon, then we would notice. And it's not just the Earth that is moving. Molecules of oxygen and nitrogen are moving in the air all around us at about 900 miles an hour. And everything else upon the earth tends to move as well. If you are an average American, you've moved or relocated more than a few times in your life. Studies say most of us will live in 12 different homes throughout our lifetime. This brings us back to the word transplant, which describes movement from one place or situation to another. I came across this word in a book I read recently. Featured in the New York Times and House and Garden magazine, Paige Dickey is a lifelong gardener and designer of gardens. She's also an author who writes about creating gardens which can extend the ambiance of our homes. In her latest book, Uprooted, she describes the journey of leaving her garden in Westchester County, New York, and moving to northern Connecticut to begin a new chapter in her life. For 34 years, she designed, nurtured, and loved that garden. Thousands of perennials and bulbs, hundreds of flowering shrubs and trees she and her husband Bosco watched grow and stretch across their property. The snowdrops, which whispered winter's close. The phlox, which announced spring's arrival. The poppies, which basked in the summer sun. Dickie and her husband were leaving behind companions which had journeyed with them through the seasons and the years of their lives. Duck Hill was the name they gave those 3 acres which she gardened so exquisitely. It was where she raised her family, the place her children brought home future spouses. It housed the table she set for her grandchildren to join her for holiday meals. She always assumed it would be her final home. So what changed? The cost of living, for one, writes Dickie. It was expensive to live 60 miles from Manhattan. Secondly, she admits, if they were being honest, it was becoming too much. The seasonal planting, the trimming of hedges, pruning of roses, deadheading the flowers, not to mention the weeding. After all, she was 74, and her husband had just turned 80. The pressure of keeping the garden up to their standards began to weigh on both of them. She writes that for weeks after they made the decision to move, she would dissolve into tears as the enormity of leaving this world she created hit her. But as she slowly accepted the necessity of the move, she wrote that she felt stirrings of excitement at the thought of finding a new nest. She began dreaming of the possibilities, a new garden, maybe an apple orchard, or a real meadow. Dickie writes the final pages of Uprooted from her new home in northern Connecticut. She reflects that when she thinks about it, she's always preferred the old and familiar, whether a beloved home or a well-worn sweater or a dog-chewed pair of boots. And yet, she can look back and remember a few of the dramatic changes in her life. Packing an overnight bag and abruptly leaving college one spring day when her family was in crisis. Walking away from 2 marriages when she found them insupportable. And it was through those memories she knew she could leave once again, even a home she once thought she wanted to live in for the rest of her life. Her husband Bosco also experienced unthinkable changes in his life. As a young boy in Hungary, he lost his home and all his belongings. As an adult, he lost his wife to cancer. When Dickie told a new neighbor the name of her latest book, he looked at her and replied, "It's a topic of great complexity, which so many of us face. Transplanting." In that uprooting, that transplanting, shares Dickie, I've also slowly shed a way of thinking of myself as a gardener. Throughout the pages of the book, she describes how she came to embrace this new person she had become. This new life she was transplanted into, across and beyond where she had been, to be planted somewhere new. Mark, I know you have an example of another writer who experienced transplanting. And unlike Paige Dickey and her husband Bosco, it wasn't a necessity. It wasn't forced upon her, but it was really her choice.
That's right. Her name is Jhumpa Lahiri. And in 2012, she moved her family from the United States to Italy, where she decided to give up speaking and writing in English, and chose from that point on to only speak, to read, to write in Italian. What made Lahiri's decision so unusual, remarkable really, was she had previously won a Pulitzer Prize for her book, Interpreter of Maladies, which she wrote in English. Now, a writer's pilgrimage to Italy, it's not unique at all. I mean, Goethe and Hawthorne made similar journeys, but what was extraordinary about Lahiri's decision was that while those writers found a temporary new address in Italy, Lahiri was seeking an entirely new language along with her new address. In 2022, Lahiri published a novel called Whereabouts, which she then wrote in Italian. Critics commented how they sensed Lahiri had evolved into this entirely new writer. As one English professor put it, reviewing her book, notes, Lahiri's imagination is now different, as are the shape of her sentences. Reflecting on the experience, Lahiri writes this: "It seems that my decision to write in Italian has emerged from nothing, but this isn't true. My life is a series of grafts. One after the other, I myself have become the graft." And then she goes on to reflect in a fascinating way on what a graft means to her. She writes this: "A graft engenders something original and hybrid. It can be exploited to correct a developmental defect, that is, to improve a species, to make it stronger, more resistant. A graft introduces one element into another, and it requires a connection and a fusion and a welding. It implies joining one thing to another. Because it's a transplant, a graft necessitates a displacement. It results, ideally, in a transformation that can feel magical. But for a graft to work," writes Lahiri, "one needs to have faith and patience, because the process is characterized by fragility. It is full of uncertainty when you are transplanting." And so she writes, "One needs to hope. Hope that with time, a new branch will grow. In my case, as a writer and as a person, I seek to grow a new variety of myself."
A new variety of myself. What a vivid image.
Hmm.
That's really powerful. And I appreciate how she connects transplant with fragility and uncertainty, hope, and transformation.
Hmm.
That we can move across or beyond to be planted anew somewhere else. And in that process, we can be formed into something new, which is also how Dickie felt after her move.
Yeah, exactly. And I love how you began with the idea that all of life is moving. I couldn't agree more. Then there's this quote I've always appreciated by the dancer Martha Graham. She says this: all that is important is this one moment in movement. So make the moment important, vital, and worth living. In other words, since life is movement, being transplanted and transformed, with that knowledge, Graham says, don't waste that moment in movement.
Exactly. See it, this very moment, as something important, vital, and what makes life worth living. In the upcoming episodes of this podcast, we will continue to add words to the lexicon of life and death. We'll look to words from the English language as well as other languages. We'll reflect on the book, The Genius of Language by Wendy Lesser. And we'll look to Susie Dent, author of Past Perfect. In the meantime, we invite you to listen to our other podcast series, Voices of the Completed Life and Gifts of the Completed Life. To find them, please go to our website, completedlife.org, click on the tab marked Programs, and then scroll down to Podcasts. Thank you to Mark Barger Elliott for joining me today, and to Zoe Wilshire, editor of Completed Life Podcasts. If you would like to be in touch with us or have an idea or story for Completed Life Podcast, please email us at info@completedlife.org. Thank you again for joining us.